welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For today's episode, I have the honor of interviewing Brian Livingston. Brian is an Appalachian Trail thru-hiker, former lawyer, and the author of The Habits of Squirrels, a fiction book inspired by his experiences on the Appalachian Trail. I'm here with Brian Livingston, the author of The Habits of Squirrels. Brian, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me on.
Now, you're not the same Brian Livingston who wrote multiple nonfiction books about Microsoft Windows back in the 1990s.
I am not. I'm having trouble distinguishing myself from him on Amazon because no matter what I seem to do, he comes up as well. Muscular Portfolios, I think, is one of his books.
Yeah, and then he wrote some books back in the early 90s about Windows 3.1.
Yeah, I remember looking those up when I guess, Alta Vista'd my name back in the 90s. So it was funny to see him crop back up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the reason why I added my middle name to the name I go under as an author is because I did an Amazon search for Aaron Camp, and one of the books that came up was, I don't think it was written by someone by that name, but it was a book about Adolf Hitler, and that's not something I really wanted to be associated with.
Yeah, especially if you can avoid it.
And anyways, feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Of course. I'm Brian Livingston. I'm the author of The Habits of Squirrels. I was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. Got my BA in history from Clemson University. After that, I thru-hiked the Appalachian Trail and then started law school at Washington and Lee University School of Law. And draw most of my writing, especially for The Habits of Squirrels, from sort of the outdoor adventures and the thru-hike at the Appalachian Trail.
Now, by thru-hiking the Appalachian Trail, does that mean that you've hiked the entire Appalachian Trail from one end to the other on a single hike?
Yeah. Started in northern Georgia and walked more or less straight through to middle Maine.
That is a very long hike. It obviously has to be over many days with rest stops overnight.
Yeah. 144 days, more or less continuously hiking. Then, the occasional, maybe once or twice a week, pop into a small town, get a hotel room and shower. Stopped and saw my parents for a little while.
Now, without spoiling too much of your book, what is The Habits of Squirrels about?
So, it, like I said, it draws very heavily from my own thru-hike, but it's a fictional guy, a fictional trail, although it's the Great Eastern Trail, which shares a name with the real trail. But the protagonist is Gabe Jenkins. He's a recently retired mailman who sets out to thru-hike the Great Eastern Trail to sort of figure out what he's about and see how, reassess his life, his career, his family relationships. And, the highlights of the book, for me at least, are sort of the weird characters, the eccentric characters that he meets along the way, and then just sort of the fun landscapes and different, views and mountains and everything that he climbs.
Now, there's an image of the cover of the book on your website, and I love the cover design of The Habits of Squirrels. Who designed that cover?
Oh man, I'm forgetting her name, but her company name is CBA Illustrations, and I found her. She's a professional graphic designer, a graphic artist, and cover designer. I found her on Reedsy.com, which is sort of like Craigslist or Angie's List for self-published authors.
Okay, I was going to ask you if your book was self-published or traditionally published, but you've said it's self-published. Yep. What was the self-publishing process like for you?
It was, it can be overwhelming at times. I tried like the devil to be traditionally published, and it just didn't work out going that route. So, it was, that when you're doing that, it starts to feel like nothing's moving. And then, once you get to the self-publishing process, it moves a lot faster, but, I got an editor and worked with him on, sort of making the book look more professional and really hit home what I was trying to say. And then, it was really um, gratifying to get to reach out and make the book sort of exactly how I wanted it to be. There are tough days. I spent a whole day fighting with sort of the placement of the barcode and just dealing with stuff that I never thought I would have to deal with when I started writing. But it was really fun. And then when you finally do get to hold your own book in your hands and it looks exactly the way that you want it to look, it's a really nice experience.
Now, do you plan on writing more books in the future?
I do. I'm currently working on another book. I'm just trying to keep honing it and keep learning and keep writing. I've enjoyed the process so far, so I'd love to keep at it and see where it takes me.
Now, what is your typical writing routine like if you have one?
So when I wrote The Habits of Squirrels, I was still a full-time attorney. So I'd wake up in the morning and write for a couple hours before work, go into work, do the things that had to be done there, come home, cook dinner, do all the little tasks, walk the dog, and then try and write for a couple hours before I went to bed. Right now, I'm mostly writing just in the morning, so it just kind of depends on what my level of dedication or determination is at the current time. Motivation, I think is the word.
Now, you mentioned a little bit about having been a lawyer, and you practiced law in South Carolina for 5 years. Am I correct about that?
Yep, 5.5 years.
5.5 years. Now, what was that experience like, and what types of cases were you representing a side on?
So I started off, I was a prosecutor. So prosecuting everything from, check fraud, forgeries, shoplifting, up to murder, just the entire spectrum, really. And then after about 2.5, maybe 3 years of that, I switched over to insurance defense, which is more of defending car wrecks and premises liability cases and sort of more run-of-the-mill stuff like that.
And what was the transition from being a lawyer to writing a fiction book like?
It's interesting, particularly when you're doing private practice. Law is very regimented, and there's a process that you do for every case that you don't really want to stray from too much because it can sort of open you up to malpractice liability or just not work out for your client. And then when you start writing, you have, like we talked about, like a routine, and you may have some sort of process, but writing's more, I guess, results oriented, maybe the phrase. Just whatever gets you the best product on the page, whatever path you have to take to that. So it can be a lot more circuitous than just sort of the straightforward law practice.
Well, Brian, that was my final question, so I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author Podcast.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me on.
Brian was a wonderful guest for this podcast, and once again, I thank him for agreeing to appear on this podcast. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at authoraac and on Instagram at aacscribe. Copyright 2022, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.